The key thought behind the book of Nahum comes right at the beginning. There's no surprise ending. Rather, it predicts the ending of Israel's oppressor. God is indeed slow to anger, which is good for you and for me, but it also applies to our enemies, those who oppress us. That can sound like a bad idea, God being slow to anger, when someone's actively doing things that demean us or cause us pain. The idea that God is being slow to anger is a good thing earlier in the Bible when it applies to God's covenant people themselves. However, when it applies to Nineveh and Assyria, it means suffering is allowed. The idea of God emphatically not leaving sin unpunished sounds a bit like bad news, but it also gets turned into hope for relief when applied to the enemies of God's covenant people. This is our text that we're going to examine a little bit together. The Lord is a jealous and avenging God. The Lord is avenging and wrathful. The Lord takes vengeance on his adversaries and keeps wrath for his enemies. The Lord is slow to anger and great in power. The Lord will by no means clear the guilty. His way is in the whirlwind and storm, and the clouds are the dust of his feet. He rebukes the sea and makes it dry. He dries up all the rivers. Bashan and Carmel wither. The bloom of Lebanon withers. The mountains quake before him. The hills melt. The earth heaves before him, the world and all who dwell in it. Who can stand before his indignation? Who can endure the heat of his anger? His wrath is poured out like fire, and the rocks are broken into pieces by him. A relatively well-known story in the book of Exodus comes from chapter 32. The children of Israel make a golden calf and worship it. This comes when Moses had gone up unto the mountain, and they're there in the wilderness. They wonder what had happened to him. They made an idol and said, "This is the God who brought us out of Egypt." This is a direct violation of the second and third commandment, which says, "You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and the fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain." God's nature is revealed in this commandment as being jealous and inspecting, watching to see how sin might rise again from generation to generation. He sees his people. He sees them. He says he is characterized by steadfast love. However, they have just broken both of these commandments in Exodus 32. God tells Moses about this issue while he's up on the mountain. And Moses comes down from the mountain and confronts the people. He destroys the idol. God sends a plague on the people. God tells Moses he's going to visit the people and destroy them because of their sin. Moses enters into negotiations with God. He prays on behalf of the people and asks that God would be with them, but be with them in a way that is not destroying. Then Moses asks, "Please show me your glory." God says he will do that, but man can't see God and live. So he instructs Moses to go up into the mountain, and he goes up into Mount Sinai, and God places Moses in the cleft of the rock and covers him with his hand. So rather than an idol representing God in a visual way, God provides the verbal revelation of himself in these words. The Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. The words slow to anger and will by no means clear the guilty are present here also. But in this passage, they are minor points because there's a lot of positive language saying that God is merciful, gracious, abounding in steadfast love, faithful, forgiving iniquity, sin, and transgression. There's a parallel here to the second commandment, but with a fresh revelation of God filled with positive ideas. It also has some parallel to the burning bush incident back in Exodus 3, where God reveals himself as I am that I am. The fresh revelation of God being characterized by steadfast love is not only repeated in this passage, it is a repeated theme in many Old Testament passages. We can't cover all the places that it is repeated, but notably Jonah 4:2 discusses how God has steadfast love and is slow to anger. Jonah, in fact, did not want to preach in Nineveh because he understood that God was compassionate and slow to anger. The Assyrians were a brutal people who conquered the surrounding nations. Jonah had no desire that they should receive mercy. The word chesed is often translated in different ways. Translators often struggle to convey it just how great this loving kindness or steadfast covenant love is. Nahum, whose name means comfort, brings a message of comfort to God's covenant people by declaring that God is jealous, avenging and wrathful to take vengeance on his adversaries. This has been, in human terms, slow in coming. This trait of God being slow to anger is what people want in terms of their own sin, but do not want this if someone is sinning against them. The trait may not feel all that welcome in a world of Hitler, Stalin, or Ashurbanipal, the brutal leader of Nineveh. He hung the skins of conquered people on his wall. He broke the legs of enemy officers if they'd just been a little too slow in surrendering. Nahum wants to bring comfort to God's covenant people by reminding them of how God had previously been with them in suffering. He helps them think about God parting the Red Sea at the Exodus and stopping the Jordan River 40 years later as they enter the Promised Land. He reminds them also of a drought in Bashan, which was the area for grazing cattle in ancient Israel. God is the source of how this grazing land has water and also when it is experiencing drought. He also reminds them of Carmel as the mountain where Elijah challenged down the prophets of Baal at the end of that major drought. We might think of our human institutions like cities and empires lasting forever. They have a life cycle, though. God will bring them to an end, just as he brings an end to the life cycle of the flowers of Lebanon. We think of the ground we walk upon as one of the most stable things we experience, but volcanic activity and earthquakes show us this is only relative to God's plan. We are warned about a final judgment. This is how God will providentially stop those who oppress others, those who oppress us. It may appear slow in coming, but when it comes, all that seems to be solid for that system of oppression, it breaks apart. God will one day end all suffering. That day may come at any time. Be comforted as we look forward to God's deliverance.